Sayın Boliban Brazan Navgini Bobatunuz Obodo, the Regulation on whatever Chancellor and Teshipiki Junction, Majella Jazzo. Rinjin do the most young Kamalan and London Zimber, meaning there's all court the digital Charles and Church dedicated Magas to the paper. Pajilo Mujela Jazzo Zampa Jamodeno Zemo Bumington, Jabi was a body of the Amsa, or Chisla, don't dodge, Sosnas and Teshiki, Jazzo. That's it. And the also Malagate and the other occasion do the purpose and the Welcome to our study, which today is going to be the beginning of a new work. It's a work which incorporates what we sometimes slightly misleadingly refer to as Buddhist philosophy with meditation. So joining these two together, and what sometimes is referred to as the tenet systems, which are really and this is where we have the brilliance of this particular work by a very great Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche, who is in many places a household name, very well known among Western students, particularly in Europe and the US, within the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions. But Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso is essentially a yogi. But he's a yogi who very compassionately embraced the path of scholarship, really on the basis of great realization, and came to presenting what is generally then known as philosophy, including ontology, epistemology, all of that, what we call Madhyamika, Pramana, Prajna, Paramita, etc., embracing all of that from the point of view of experience. And so his presentation now of what we very often hear about, namely the tenet systems, which includes what we call the Vibhashika, the Suchantika, the Yogacharya, the Madhyamika, the Greater Madhyamika, and so on. All of these, which really are part of understanding the Buddhist system. The Buddhist system, of course, is addressed to so many different individuals according to different capacities, etc. And in this way, there are various angles to come at it. But what we have here is this approach that really sees everything as being a progression, and as such, really linked together in terms of our own personal development. So we're not talking about different schools of thought as much as we're more talking about different ways that we can look at our own experience and appreciate how we experience things. So with having laid the ground with the Abhidharma teachings, we already know now the way in which we operate with experience. And Abhidharma, yes, it talks about various things. We have, after all, an experience that is counted on, and don't fall over now, but count on, we have, for example, 5 senses. So when we talk about the 5 senses, it's not like the Buddhists are saying, oh my God, there's 5, how will I remember that? But 5 senses are what we're operating with all the time. So the Abhidharma does bring us into our experience and says, look, you have 5 senses and they have their object. And on the basis of your faculties and the object, you have conscious experience. So that's where we already have some sense of beginning to map our reality. And that's only fair enough, since after all, what we are doing with the Buddhist teaching is beginning to look at our reality. We're not looking into books. We're not listening to long lectures. We're coming back to our immediate experience. And that's where, having then laid the ground in experience, then of course, this is something that we integrate in the course of the practice of meditation. And within meditation, then, we have 2 aspects, which is the shamatha, where we actually connect with experience. I was just talking with a friend today about the curious fact that in within Buddhist cultures and Asia in general, and outside of our particular strange culture, there's not a lot of fiction. You know, in our culture, we love to go into dream worlds and fiction, and so much of what our culture is about is entirely cerebral. It's disconnected from feeling, touching, connecting. And that's where also we have a tendency to become very rigid in our belief systems and become very aggressive. And so this really is also something that spills out into our cultural practices, which very often are aggressive. So that's where you can see the wisdom cultures, not so much aggression, not so much imperialism, not so much this sort of getting caught up in ideas, but more about connecting with the immediate. And that's where, again, Western mythology goes into the idea that meditation isn't that where you go off into a different place. No, it's the exact opposite. But because it has a radical effect in terms of appreciation, in terms of calming down, then it's sort of associated with the culture of dope. It's associated with the culture of dreaming and otherworldliness and so on. If you're calm, well, that's got to be because you're on a different planet. So that's where so much cultural misunderstanding takes place, which is really tragic. But the good news is that we have teachers that are willing to take on students and willing to communicate. And we have that right from the time of the Buddha, except this communication is not about going out there and converting the world, but very much within the atmosphere that the Buddha himself established with, which is, if there's somebody who's willing to listen, if they're interested, yes, then the teachings are there. But there's never been any missionary activity really in the Buddhist world. And as such, then you have really from the time of the Buddha, only really a situation of teaching when there's somebody who's really interested and listening and open. And then something takes place. And it initially is about the information, the data, yes, working with, you could share shared ground of perceptions, but then the teacher takes the student into a place that the student hadn't been before. So there's a journey into something more subtle and more awake. And so when we engage in this kind of study, what we are really doing is enhancing our horizons, opening up in a greater degree of softness, vulnerability, sensitivity, compassion, insight, clarity, sharpness, strength, and so forth, qualities of awakening on the basis of us investigating and connecting with reality. So in this way, we are uncovering really we're not just establishing new what you could say capacities that we didn't have before, because all along the line what the Buddha saw is that we have a capacity of wisdom. It's just been obscured. We have all of this. We are confused, but it's a curable condition. And that's where the Buddha goes in like a doctor with a scalpel, and this scalpel is called prajna. It's the ability to see through our assumptions, to see through appearances, to see more, and to be willing to see more. And that's where we initially have to be at a place where we want to hear and listen and take in some new possibilities. And that's what we do with hearing the teaching, listening to the teaching. And then we expand on that in terms of then reflecting. I've heard something that was different from what I've heard before. And so it haunts us. It stays with us. We question, why did that? What was meant with that? And that's where we reflect. And of course, within the teaching, we would always say it's essential really to, when we hear the teaching, then to cut through hesitation, to actually arrive at a place where we really understand. And once we have understanding, then we integrate this understanding through meditation. And meditation, that is what then enables us to align ourselves more with reality. Through listening and through reflecting on the teaching, we begin to cotton on to and be savvy about the nature of reality. And while this initially is about us understanding, then with the practice of meditation, it's integrating this on a deeper level. So of course we could call it something that transforms us as person, but it's really just that we become more in touch with others, we become more in touch with ourselves. We develop a soft spot for ourselves, a soft spot for our world, a soft spot for the others in our life, etc. And all of this on the basis of seeing how unnecessary it is that we wander in a cycle of frustration and pain. So the implication here with us studying this progressive status on emptiness is that we begin to develop this prajna. When we say emptiness, this is where emptiness is that which sees the absence of what we thought was there. We thought there was something there that was hard and fast, but it's not. We create what Trillian Rinpoche calls obstruction. We begin to create obstruction in terms of our person. We become obstructed individuals. We become brittle. We become rigid. We have a strong sense of me and my personal pain and my anguish with regards to my experience. And we objectify the external as hard and fast and also as rigid and solid. And that's where emptiness is, where we dip the, like Aryadeva says, it's a bit like we dip some cloth in acid and we take it up again and the cloth is still there, but we really just need to blow on it and it sort of goes away. And our solidity is really just something that we perpetuate through habit and through being unimaginative and being just bullheaded and perpetuating, regurgitating narratives about self and other. And so with the practice of prajna that sees emptiness, that sees how everything really exists in terms of just a set of conditions, which we then call dependent arising or dependent origination, when we see that things are really just a web of causes and conditions that everybody sees in a different way, we begin to see that our perception of things as solid as they are actually questionable. So with this openness and inquiry, we begin to see emptiness. So emptiness doesn't mean that things go away. It actually means that we take away the narrow way in which we pigeonhole things and we begin to see a wider perspective. So we could just as well call it meditation on fullness. It could be a meditation on openness. We use the emptiness for the Sanskrit term shunyata, which really means is there's nothing there to grasp. And that we're going to have to get used to on the Buddhist path. We're willing to not grasp onto something. And that's again where Buddhism is very different from philosophy, because in philosophy you're trying to find an idea that you then take and say, now I figured it out. Except, as we know, it just doesn't work. We have 2,500 or whatever, 3,000 years of philosophy in the Western world. We've been trying to think about things. And as soon as you have one philosopher saying something from his particular point of view, then you have another person that's from their point of view looking at something else, seeing the relativity of what the previous bloke said, then you have somebody saying something else. And so it goes down through history, one point of view after the other. And that's where with emptiness, we're actually abandoning the idea of having a point of view. We're beginning to just simply feel and be present and actually begin to open up. And that's what we mean then with emptiness. And with that also comes the relinquishing of the whole insecurity of fixating on self. And that's where the outcome of this process is compassion. It's where the retreating into self versus other becomes more an empathy with other and an appreciation of other. So that's where the qualities of the sage is not some person that sort of retreats from the world and saying, you're all stupid, I'm off, I'm not doing this anymore. The sage is somebody who empathizes with the world. Of course, sages, yes, sometimes have simple lives, sometimes traditionally have lived in very simple situations, but never ever from the point of view of abandoning the world, very much from the point of view of wishing to get to the bottom of what really ails what's what's gotten wrong with all of us. So that's a little bit about then what we're looking at now. So this work, it came about when Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, he was asked by the 16th Karmapa to travel to the West in 1976, I gather, and he then began having students teaching both in Europe and the States. I remember in Denmark there was a lot of us, a lot of my friends really, who began studying with Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso. I remember receiving teachings from him first time when he came to Copenhagen in 1977, August 77. He taught on the 9 yanas, and he was in the entourage of the 16th Karmapa and Jamgön Kongtrul Lodrötaye, and he stayed on in Europe, and he taught in France, in Brussels, in Denmark. I think he visited, maybe, I'm not sure, but certainly he had groups then all over Europe, and very committed students that followed through. And I know Rinpoche also traveled to the States and taught in Trungpa Rinpoche's centers and elsewhere. And during that time then, he gave a number of teachings, which then he asked one of his students to write down. Yes, Shenpen Hukam, that's right. Shenpen Hukam and also other students together, they compiled this work, and it was then edited over the years. So it's been through a few editions. So this edition here, I think we have, is from 2016 or something like that, fairly recent. So anyway, let's begin the text itself. The introduction. So, progressive stages of meditation on emptiness. In Tibetan, it's Tongni Gumrim. The stages of meditation on emptiness, yes, is a series of meditation practices on a particular aspect of the Buddha's teaching. The idea is that by beginning with one's first, rather coarse, common sense understanding, one progresses through increasingly subtle and more refined stages until one arrives at a complete and perfect understanding. So with the Buddhist teaching, we're not here to just be following the doctor and look at the doctor, but there's the implication that we actually do something about our confusion. So that's where we begin relating to what we're experiencing, not what we are hoping to experience, not what we're sitting there waiting for something to happen, but looking at what we actually feel, what we experience. And that's where we begin with what we presently are experiencing. And then we look at that and we begin to be less caught up in what we call the cause of suffering, which is the fixation that we were just talking about. And so he says each stage in the process prepares the mind for the next, insofar as each step is fully integrated into one's understanding through the meditation process. So through the practice of meditation, something begins to loosen. We first have an insight, we can recognize there's a truth happening here, and we then begin to be less entangled in that confusion. And to be less entangled doesn't mean that we say, okay, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to be a good boy, a good girl. I won't do that anymore. No, that's not how we do it. We do it through the practice of meditation, where we begin to be aware that thoughts, impulses come up, but we're under no obligation to do like what Mingyur Rinpoche says, which is like, yes, boss. As soon as the thought comes up, I like this or I don't like this, then we don't just do yes, boss, but we're just aware that this impulse comes up and we're under no obligation to follow through. So that's where, through listening to the teachings, we begin to actually see, hey, I'm doing something that's not working. So that's where I want to actually be clear on what is it that's wrong with this and why would I want to do otherwise. And that's where we understand, oh yeah, this brings suffering for myself, for others. And it's actually not properly relating to what's there. So that's where we integrate this understanding through a meditation process. Through the process of meditation, we allow the space in which we can let go of habitual patterns. So 3 stages in the process of understanding. So he says, meditation should be understood as the 3rd stage in the development of one's understanding. The first stage is to listen to or study the teachings with an open and receptive mind that does not distort what is being heard or studied. So that's where we, in Words of My Perfect Teacher and elsewhere, very often come across these teachings on how to listen, how to actually perceive the teaching, how to perceive the teacher, the fellow students, the time, the place, and specifically to be aware of our motivation and to remember what the teaching was. So that's where we would say we'd want to be like the like a cup or a receptacle. What's it called? Yes, pot, which is free from the 3 defects. One is that the pot is upside down. So that's when we're just distracted and not really paying attention. And we just sort of like to be there, but we're not really listening. The second is that there's a hole in the pot, the leaky pot. So that's where we hear things, but then we don't really pay attention to it afterwards. And that's where we then quickly forget. And then there's the last one, which is the pot with the poison inside, the toxic. That's where when we have a motivation, for example, we say, I'm going to learn this so I can become a meditation teacher. I'm going to make a career out of this. And that's, again, really using the Dharma just for our own gratification or our own self-centered purpose. So that's where then we have a flawed attitude. So in this way, listening to the teaching has to come with a pure motivation, with this open and receptive mind, where there's this deep respect of the validity of what's being taught. And then we seek to retain it. Then the second stage is carefully to reflect on what has been received in order to clarify its true significance. So that's where we take the teaching with us and we reflect. If there's something that we don't understand, then reflect on it. The good thing about not understanding something is then it haunts us and bothers us. And then we turn it in the mind. Sometimes it can take years. Something might have been said that just didn't make sense. Then you sort of just keep it there and just let it sit and simmer and marinate a bit, sort of like in just the sort of the question still sits there. And then after some time, it might just be a day, it might be a year or whatever, then all of a sudden the answer comes. Or sometimes we can also ask questions and then we click. And sometimes the more that a question has bothered us, the longer it's been there and marinated, the more vivid the understanding is, and the deeper the understanding sinks in when we clarify what it was that we didn't understand. So that's where reflection is then clarifying the actual significance of what we've heard. The third stage is to integrate the newly acquired knowledge or understanding into one's being or character. So in a sense, this is like putting it into practice. Khenpo says, when one talks about meditation practice, one does not mean one is practicing meditation so that one day one will have perfected it and be able to give a perfect performance. Rather, it is practice in the sense of actually doing or being it, as opposed to just thinking about it. And that's where, when we're hearing the teaching, it sounds like it's something outside of ourselves. We might hear we should be patient or we should be compassionate. And say, okay, that's an interesting thought. Well, why would I want to be that? It's a world full of dreadful people. And so why should I do that? And then we sort of begin to think about it. And that's where we understand maybe that those people who are dreadful, they actually are not innately dreadful. And maybe it also, for us to perceive exactly that in those people, has something to do with ourselves. And the more we reflect about it, the more we understand the flaw in our assumptions. And that's where all of a sudden the teaching on non-aggression is not something that's external to us. It's actually part of who we are. We actually see that this is something that completely aligns ourselves with our well-being. Just like if we eat healthy food, it's something that integrates within ourselves. It's part of us. So that's where meditation is, where we begin to actually align ourselves with the natural capacity. 3 fields of investigation. So Khenpo says the whole of Buddhism is structured around this threefold training in listening, reflecting, and meditating. He says, while Buddhist scholars concentrate on studying or listening to the Buddha's teachings, which is the first phase, then the logicians study valid means of knowing and reasoning, the tools with which one reflects and is able to discern what is true and false. So that's the place where we then validate. So first is to hear the teaching, but then there's also validating it. Is this valid? Would I want to do this? Is this actually valid in the sense that this is actually add up? So you have teachings like, for example, the teachings of emptiness. And that's where it's not going to be very helpful if we just sort of say, oh yes, my teacher says all phenomena are empty. Well, that sounds great. Well, maybe one day I'll understand it. And then it's sort of just left at that, shelve it away. And that's where we actually need to apply inquiry, hard logic, to see what exactly is meant by that. And that's where the validation is essential, because unless we have that, then we just have sort of simple blind faith. Then we're just saying, oh yeah, you know, the Lord said so, it must be true. But we need to bring to this project a good sense of doubt, cynicism, skepticism, that says, oh yeah, well, how exactly? And that's where we need to trust the Buddha enough to not just say, oh, well, whatever, dude, but to actually say, okay, this is really interesting. I don't understand it, but I'm going to find out what is meant by it. And that's why our initial confusion when we come about the teaching is the foundation for faith. Because once we actually see, that's what's meant with it, then all of a sudden we have a deep trust. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, well, you know, the Dalai Lama seems to be a jolly good fellow, and, you know, let's just tag along. But once we actually understand what he's talking about, then we see this is radical, this is important. And that's where we then achieve what we call certainty. And so that's where we operate with this valid means of knowing and reasoning. So then he says, this corresponds to the stage of reflection. The yogins or meditators are those who have established through listening and reflection what must be the case, and who are now engaged in training themselves in the art of abandoning their delusions. So that's where we then humbly are aware where it is that we have warts and we have all sorts of confused conditions, but we're going to cure them. We actually can see, yes, I need to do this, I need to do this and that, and I can actually cure these warts. I can actually be free of this condition that drives suffering. And so that's where the yogins then, having established the validity of the medicine, they're actually then taking the medicine. So that's where they are abandoning their delusions. So it is one thing to decide through reasoning what must be true, and another actually to see the world in this way. So that's where we, again, seeing the world clearly doesn't mean that we've been told how to see the world, but it's where, just like when we have a rope that's misperceived as a snake, we look and we can see, there's not what I thought there was. What a relief. So Khenpo says, by relying on these 3 practices and using each to enhance the other, the fog of confusion and clouds of ignorance are removed. Knowledge and understanding can then shine forth unimpeded, like the sun breaking through the mist at dawn. There you go. Yes, I'll give you a perfect example. Voila, that's what it's going to be like. Three ways to remove doubt. At the listening stage, a person should study the Buddha's words in the sutras and commentaries. The commentaries are then sometimes referred to as shastras. So, you know, the sutras are the Buddha's words, and then the commentaries, then later, Indian masters they very kindly engaged with their world around them. They didn't just shut themselves up in a monastery and say, we're studying the holy, the holy sutra of what the Buddha said, but they actually saw the sense of what the Buddha said, and they communicated that. They were in the conversation with their times. They challenged the belief systems. They didn't just retreat into some little dogmatic cage, but they were actually in conversation. They challenged the existing assumptions, and that's where we then from the time of following particularly Nagarjuna up through the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th Common Era century, then yes, there was an enormous commentarial tradition. And we should see this really as something that should be an example for us, because India was very multicultural. And in this way, there were many different persons, and people talked together and they made sense of each other. And so this very compassionate attitude, it wasn't a nerdy project of intellectuals. It was actually engaging and finding common ground where you could talk together. So that's where we have then the sutras from the Buddha, the commentaries from great masters, and we should rely on explanations like these of qualified teachers who then can clarify one's doubts. We have it nowadays, where you also have compassionate teachers by Chogyam Trungpa, who understood the Western mind and who was able to then clarify the sense of the teaching through knowing both, on one hand, not just the words of the Buddha, but the actual experience of awakening, and then also understanding the audience. And so we also have this with someone like Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, who also very much, in a very unreserved way, engaged with his students. Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso is famous. Now he's rather old and retired and mainly in retreat, but he was very well known for a very unreserved engagement with his students. And then it says, at the reflecting stage, one discovers further areas that lack clarity, and the teacher's guidance will again be required. After further reflection, yet more doubts may arise, so that the process has to be repeated until a certitude concerning the meaning and significance of the teaching has arisen. So that's where we should consult with the teacher. We should consult with fellow sangha, instructors, and so on, when there are things that we don't understand. Then we arrive at clarity. And then Khenpo says, with this certitude or confidence, one is able to embark on meditation. Through meditation, doubts and hesitations should disappear. So if one finds them increasing, one should resort once more to listening and reflecting. So we clarify the sense of the teaching so we can meditate. And then in meditation, actual experience, then things clarify. We understand things. So that's what should happen. And if there are things that we still aren't clear about, then we should again study more, pursue this, ask, and arrive at certainty. So Khenpo says, as the doubts disappear, one experiences directly the true meaning of the teachings, so that eventually one's meditation stabilizes, free from hesitation or uncertainty. So that's what we want to do. So this is where Buddhism is a little bit different from just sort of having a church where you sign up. But this is actually, there's a process that needs to be undertaken, just like when we engage in a treatment of some sort with a therapist or a physician. Khenpo says, although people vary as to how much time they have to spend on it at each stage, everyone needs each stage of the process if they are to reach liberation. So that's where we of course, some sort of get it very quickly and progress through the stages of the path. Others need to take time. That's just normal. If we're engaged in if we have a particular illness, then we might need to, and we have different conditions. Some are quickly cured and others require just to spend more time. It's not about good or bad in any way. It's just honestly seeing where we're at and working with what we are. Meditation without listening and reflection, however, Khenpo says, is blind. But listening and reflecting without meditation is like having eyesight and no legs. So that's where to engage in meditation, not really knowing what to do, and that's sort of very common nowadays, where there's sort of this idea that you just sit down and something incredible should happen. There's a necessity to really understand what it is that we're doing. So when we sit down, there's a clarity about what it is that we're meditating on. And yet, just listening and just thinking and studying and having all the books and so on without practicing meditation, then again, that's like being able to see, but not really being able to do much about it. We can't move. 3 texts to follow, and this corresponds perfectly. This is, of course, talking from the Kaji perspective, but in fact, this is also what in Siddhartha's intent has been exactly happening. It's the same texts. Khenpo talks about something called the dual ornament of liberation, which is the Kaji Lamrim text. In the Nyingma, we have the words of my perfect teacher in general. And for those who go more in depth, then you have works like Longchenpa's Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind. So that's where you have a Lamrim text that sort of gives an idea where this is heading. But then you underscore that, you substantiate that with some very substantial works that drive home certainty in principle, which are then the teachings on Madhyamika, as per Chandrakirti's introduction to the Middle Way, and Asanga and Maitreya's the Uttara Tantra Shastra. And so the first is very much about practice. The other, they're about, you could say, cushioning or substantiating this, bolstering the practice with the view. Problem is with some of these texts is that they're really intended, you could say, for experts. They're intended for persons who deeply commit to pushing through till they have full understanding. And sometimes when the modern audience is exposed to Madhyamika teaching, there's sometimes the reasonings that are applied in the Madhyamika teaching, they kind of, they might be difficult to grasp. And that's where the modern audience, who is sort of expecting to just sort of hear the guru and enjoy the presence of the guru, might not exactly see this as something that needs to be taken home and actually worked with, and rather just say, well, I didn't understand it, or I did understand it, and then sort of leave it at that. And so the teachings, particularly of the Madhyamika, need actually to be pursued, because it's without the Madhyamika teachings, we're never really going to understand much of what we're doing on the Buddhist path. So that's why it's very important, and at this juncture, really 21st century Buddhism, it's very important that language develops around the middle way teachings that's clear and transparent. Of course, the works that we're studying are all very valid, but they're sometimes very difficult, and that's where the audience needs to be, on one hand, informed that they really need to use all their ability and capacity to really integrate this, and also the teachers need to really meet the audience where the audience's experience is, and sometimes this can be a little bit a weak point in the modern communication. Anyway, these 3 works that then we're talking about here, they have a lot to do with how we then engage with the subject matter in the Nyingma and Kaji tradition. So Khenpo says there are Buddhist texts that correspond to each stage of this process. For example, the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, the Dakotajin by Gampopa, lays out the path and stages of the Bodhisattva, according to the Mahayana Sutra. This corresponds to the listening stage, where one learns about the vast and profuse aspects of the relative truth. For example, karma, impermanence, love, and compassion. So these are the fundamental reflections. One can practice progressive stages of meditation, Gumrim, on this text by reflecting systematically on its main points. Thus, by studying this text, one can reflect and meditate on relative truth. So this engages us in principle with understanding our world, our relative world. Again, the problem is that as much as this is about relative truth, again, it's situated within, and it was written in a culture where there was a far more sophisticated science that went beyond just the superficial science that objectifies matter and understands the workings and functionings of the external material world, and went into the dimensions of the phenomenology of awakening to also identify the constructed nature of these external perceptions and how that is contingent on the observer, and also understanding the nature of this observer when it's confused and not confused. So that's where we have these experiences or phenomenologies of, on one hand, confusion, and the phenomenologies of awakening. And that's where the cultures in which Buddhism flourished had a far more sophisticated and in-depth understanding of the world at large and the nature of the world. And when we talk about the law of karma and so forth, the stages of the path, this is situated within cultures where persons were living within a discourse that acknowledged this. Very different from our experience in the present day. And again, this is where the audience here in the modern day need to actually make an effort to go beyond some of the assumptions that are, you could say, basic to the culture that we're coming from in the modern world. So that's where the preliminary reflections on relative truth again require a lot of engagement from the point of view of the audience, the students. The Madhyamika-vatara, the Umalajukpa by Chandrakirti, gives a logical exposition of the absolute truth of emptiness. And that again requires an insight into how the reality that we are perceiving is really just the reality of how we tend to misconstrue reality. And that's where Chandrakirti is someone who expounds the absence of inherent existence in anything, whether it comes from our perceptions, our culture, the existing array of philosophies, and our experience of ourself, and so forth. All these places in which we solidify. That's where Chandrakirti shows the middle way, which is really the absence of solidification, the absence of belief in things as solid, and also the absence of philosophical reference points, opening up to actual experience and relinquishing our belief systems around ourself, the retreating into the notion of a solid self and the notion of the solid observed phenomenal world, and how that duality is actually completely, that is flawed if we investigate. And that's where absolute truth is found again through us beginning to analyze and look at reality. And that's where the absolute truth of emptiness is seeing this openness. That's where reality is not limited by our confused projections. And this is then the teachings that we find in this work called the Madhyamika-vatara by Chandrakirti. Again, an extremely sophisticated but also verifiable science of understanding reality. And this very much corresponds then to what we also call the second turning of the wheel, understanding the absence of inherent existence in phenomena, emptiness. And after that, then we open up to a dimension in which there's a dimension of not being confused. And that's where we touch on a ground of clarity that is innate to us. That's where we begin to connect with something that is primordially there, a primordial goodness, a primordial sense of freedom that is innate to us, and that however uptight and toxic our minds might be, our ground is never corrupted, our condition is never incurable. It's always curable. There's always a ground of Buddha nature beneath. And so that's where it says here, after studying this text, one can reflect and meditate on absolute truth. So we can't talk about an absolute truth as long as we don't contrive it in a way of being something that is grasped. It's the absence of grasp that we can call absolute truth. And so Khenpo says, this book, Progressive Stages on Meditation and Emptiness, is intended to assist the development of the meditator's understanding of this. And then he refers to then the third work, which is the Mahayana Anuttara Tantra Shastra, also known as the Ratna Gotra Vibhaga, or in Tibetan Gyulama. And both this and the Madhyamika were taught in the context of Siddhartha's intent by Tsongtse Jamgön Kongtrul Lodrötaye. So up through the late 1990s, Rinpoche taught the Madhyamika, and in the beginning of the noughties, then Rinpoche began teaching the Uttara Tantra, which was then made available under the title Buddha Nature. So those who have access to Khenpo Foundation website and elsewhere, you have actually Tsongtse Khenpo Rinpoche's teachings on these two texts available. So then the Uttara Tantra Shastra, or Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra, this is attributed in the Tibetan tradition, at least, to Maitreya. So we would say that the great sage Sangha, after meditating for many years, you probably are familiar with the story, then finally he perceived Maitreya. And he then received what we call the 5 dharmas of Maitreya. And so we have 5 major works, of which this is one of them, that then are attributed to Maitreya. So this text, Khenpo says, introduces the meditator to the doctrine of Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature, which concerns the clear light nature of mind. And we call it the clear light, but not as if it's something that's sort of out there being switched on or something external, but it's simply just the clarity of the mind, both on the subjective and the objective level. So that's where we talk about the nature of mind actually being this clear light or luminosity. Khenpo says it emphasizes, this text on Buddha nature, it emphasizes that for the ultimate realization of Buddhahood to arise, one has to experience one's true nature directly, without any conceptual effort to clear away delusion or to create an enlightened state. So this is the nature that's already there. It's not something that we think up or imagine or create or produce. It's something that is directly perceivable as the abiding condition that's innate to our mind, innate to our being. And again, referring to the text, he says, it teaches that as long as one does not experience the full extent of the powers of the enlightened mind, one has not reached complete liberation. This is a more subtle teaching than merely that of showing that all dharmas are empty of self-nature. So that's where we would say that the second turning of the wheel and the third turning of the wheel, they emphasize different aspects. One emphasizes the absence of self-nature, the emptiness nature. The other emphasizes the luminosity of this nature. So again, it should be studied and practiced after the progressive meditation on emptiness that is outlined in this book. So this book here really sets into context these studies of the Madhyamika and the Buddha nature teachings. Khenpo says the doctrine of Tathagata Garbha outlined in the Mahayana Anuttara Tantra Shastra lays the basis for understanding Vajrayana and Mahamudra teachings in practice. These teachings take for granted that practitioners have already understood the vast aspects of the relative truth and the empty nature of all dharmas, so that they are ready to relax in the clear light nature of mind, just as it is here and now, using all experience to enhance the clarity of their understanding. So that's where we need to have a proper understanding of our relative world, understanding what rules our relative experience, and where it is that we get caught, how it is that we can extract ourselves on the basis of understanding cause and effect, and then particularly understanding the absence of inherent existence. This then enables us to be more clear on the unconditioned purity that exists as the underlying condition basic to our reality. And that's where understanding relative truth, understanding the absolute truth, then we can relax into the clear light nature of mind. And that's why it's very important for us also to understand that when we say understand absolute truth, we're not talking about a realization of absolute truth. And that's where sometimes the Western audience, they get a little bit lazy and say, well, you know, we would never understand it until we experience it. And it's not like that. We actually need to go the hard yards and understand it. And then we know where it is we're heading, where it is we go wrong, where it is that we repeat our mistakes. So understanding emptiness is essential really for us to embark on the path. So once we have that, then we are not that easily deceived. And that's where we then can relax into understanding where it is that we need to not get entangled. And this is where meditation then is very helpful. And then we can engage in properly settling into the nature of mind. So, but the point also that Khenpo is making here is that all these three aspects, working with the relative truth, understanding emptiness, and the luminous nature of mind, these all go together. They have to do with understanding our reality as we ordinarily experience it, and also the vipassana, the insight that we then cultivate in terms of the spiritual path. How do the four dharmas of Gampopa fit into this progression? Well, first we say, may my mind turn to the Dharma. So that has to do with the first aspect, and that is where we understand relative truth. May my mind turn to the Dharma on the basis of understanding karma, suffering, and understanding the Four Noble Truths. We then see, yes, may my mind turn to the Dharma. May my Dharma enter into the path. May the path clarify confusion. These two have more to do with then the understanding of emptiness, and may confusion dawn as wisdom. That has more to do then with the understanding of Buddha nature, the luminous nature of mind. How feasible is it for one to engage in Vajrayana practice without having understood emptiness? Is there any point? Yeah, it's okay. You know, all the time, because in some ways it's very much based on our karma. I mean, it could look a little bit haphazard. We sort of just happen on Vajrayana. But within the Vajrayana, the other yanas are complete as well. So Vajrayana will help us to understand emptiness. And then, of course, once we get a greater understanding as we're practicing the path, then the path makes so much more sense. So we already are practicing Vajrayana the moment that we engage in Nundo practice, you know? So, and we have, particularly within Siddhartha's intent, with the Vajrayana culture, there's continually Vajrayana practice of Vajrayana sadhana, and at the same time that this is the path that really takes luminosity as the path, it also, within that, all the other elements are complete. The renunciation is complete within abandoning ordinary habitual perceptions. The refuge is there in terms of us beginning to align ourselves with truth. The bodhicitta is there in terms of us not distinguishing between this and that. Some persons more, we like some persons more, some persons less. And we purify and accumulate and establish insight into the reality continually by aligning ourselves with deity, with this luminous nature. The qualities of emptiness naturally emerge when we do this. So we shouldn't think that that something is lacking. At the same time, if we're reflecting persons that might sort of think about what we're doing, then it's necessary that we go in and do the kind of study that we're doing here. So the practice itself is fine. For example, in Tibet, you very often had people who would just go straight to Vajrayana practice and everything would be complete within it. But for us in the modern world where this is new for us, we might be reflecting on what am I doing? And that's where it's essential then that we actually get the theoretical basis and the training and the foundations that we're talking about here. I always thought Nundu was to prepare one to engage in Vajrayana practice. Well, yes, absolutely. But it is a Vajrayana, it's based on the Vajrayana premise. So it is so the moment that you're engaging, the moment that you go to driving school, you're already a car driver, you're no longer, how do you say, you're no longer excluded from the ranks of car drivers. You're doing driving schools, you're taking driving lessons, you are becoming a car driver. So Ngundu is very much Vajrayana practice. It's what we call the preliminary Vajrayana practice. Ngundu means preliminaries, referring to Vajrayana practice. And then you have what's called Ngöshi, or the main practice, which is then the practice of the four empowerments. So the importance of relative truth. So we'll look at that next time. You're welcome. Thank you. So here we can we can enjoy as the sun comes through the mist. Here we are in the landscape of relative truth, understanding its situatedness within the vastness of emptiness, and within that great expanse, then there's a continual luminous clarity that enables us to see everything and appreciate everything. So very, very apt. Yeah.
It's just I'm messing with words, but back when the author was talking about meditating on these, the Majamka or this, that, and the other, whereas the notion of meditating actually not is clear in the mind.
Yeah.
So it basically means concentrating and focusing.
Yeah. So there's a question here, how does this fit in with meditation? Because when we're meditating, aren't we supposed to just not follow after thoughts? And it sounds like there's a lot of thoughts involved here. Well, this is what we call establishing the view. So this is before we meditate. But the thing is, when we meditate, we have the confidence in just leaving the mind without engaging in ordinary ways that we objectify and fixate on things, right? That's what we're doing when we're meditating. But for us to actually think that's a good thing, we actually need to understand that those things that we ordinarily fixate on, they don't have a reality. And so when we stop fixating on things, we're beginning to come into touch with reality. And that's where we need to have the initial understanding that all the phenomena that we solidify and we fixate on actually don't have a reality. And otherwise, meditating would not be, we wouldn't be in touch with reality. Meditating is where we discontinue this way that we confuse ourselves. So Madhyamaka is what it shows us how it is that we unnecessarily confuse ourselves by objectifying things as existing in one way or existing in another. So that's where, when we're studying Madhyamaka and so on, this is where we actually begin to go, oh, I thought it was like that, but it's not like that. Ah, and then we can meditate. Then we can say, oh, I needn't keep doing this. I can actually take a break. So it's kind of like telling us the real story. Like if we have a bad dream and suddenly we realize we're just hallucinating, then we can draw a sigh of relief. So that's what the Madhyamaka teaching is intended to do. It doesn't always work like that. We might actually go home from Madhyamaka teachings rather scratching our heads. But that's because something is happening, because we're actually being exposed to some pretty radical perspectives. So it's intending that we initially scratch our heads, but then finally we go, that can take a long time. For me, it took a very long time, and it still mind boggles my mind. But that's what we do with Madhyamaka. It actually sort of pulls the plug of our assumptions. So someone says, do you recommend that we study Madhyamaka in parallel while learning this text? See how you go. I wouldn't worry too much about it. But let's study this text first, and then you'll see sort of get some handle on Madhyamaka. Sometimes the Madhyamaka texts, they can be rather daunting. So maybe let's just look at this text first and see where we are. Velbekomme. Ja, tak skal du have. Det er faktisk takket være dig. Det ved du jo godt, at jeg faktisk undersøgte denne her bog og egentlig fandt, at den er rigtig god. Så mange tak til dig. That was secret Dakini language. You don't know. Okay, we'll conclude for this time, and we'll just take a short break, and then we'll do some meditation practice. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Okay. So just a few minutes break, and then we'll begin the meditation component. So I'm going to open the discussion about meditation here just with a question that came in regards to the previous session. When we mention clarity, does it mean mental clarity? Not really. When we talk about clarity, and we have this a lot in the Buddhist texts, it really refers to the unconditional quality of cognition. So it's very neutral. Even when we're incredibly confused and dull, there's a clarity there. Of course, it's justified to use the word clarity. In Tibetan, it's salwa or rangsel. Sometimes we say zhangri rangsel, which means just the natural awareness that knows itself. We know that we're aware. You know, it's the difference when we're lost in thought, there's a knowing that's taking place. But all the time, we as individuals, we have this cognitive quality, and that's where our mind, and also when we talk about emptiness, we would say it's not just empty like the sky, it's imbued with a cognitive quality. And that's where this clarity is not so much about, you know, how we say, you know, I'm lacking clarity, you know, let me think about it, I'm not so clear right now, etc. That actually is not what we mean with the clarity. You could say the potential of this cognitive quality in its pure condition is, of course, an uncontaminated clarity. And so it's justified calling it clarity, but it's actually, it really just refers to the cognitive capacity. So when you hear the word, the unity of emptiness and clarity, just think of the insubstantial nature that's endowed with a cognitive capacity. So it's synonymous with cognition or knowing and so on. So with the practice of meditation, that is actually what we're cultivating. So with the practice of meditation, it's where we normally have muddled clarity, or we lose our clarity because we begin to get caught up in a sense of I and the object, what we call dharmas. Yesterday we were talking a little bit about dharmas and dhammata. And the dhammata is the nature of things as they are, both in terms of the subject and the object. And what gets muddled is our projections that fail to recognize things. And so with the practice of Dharma, then we regain this clarity, the full cognitive capacity. Right now we're running on, you know, we're running on a very small capacity. And it's not really that we need to build anything up. It's really just that we presently, within our not using our full capacity, we're failing to understand our reality. So that's where the study that we're undertaking now, in terms of beginning to understand things more, begin to see that the reality that we impute on things, that's where the solidity and the way that we misconstrue ourselves in the world, which brings us to suffering, it's based on some assumptions that we can actually see, if we analyze, are not valid. And once we see how we get unnecessarily caught up in confusion, then it makes so much sense to discontinue our confusion. And that's where we begin to gain clarity. That's where meditation, strangely enough, right? Because it might occasionally happen that when we meditate, when we're not busy thinking about other things, as when it looks like we're meditating very seriously, but when we actually are being just present and not tagging along with our daydreams and thoughts and so on, then notice how actually there's a well-being and a clarity that emerges. And that's not constructed. See, for the modern person, or the sort of, you know, non-meditator, or whatever you can call it, those who don't know the secret of meditation or whatever, then there's the notion that we understand things through a lot of thinking, a lot of research of the object and so on. But that's actually not how we understand our reality. Our reality is understood when we are no longer tagging along with our particular projections. And so that's when we meditate. That's where, when we allow the mind to just settle, then there's a remarkable quality that emerges there. And that's where we begin to align ourselves. It's like the difference, you know, like the difference between slouching and sitting, you know. When you slouch, you're probably going to end up feeling pretty lousy. When you sit, when you know, I'm very, you know, I'm always promoting the notion of yoga and the practice of just carrying oneself in a particular way enables us to actually, not just in a physical level, but also psychologically, to flourish. So that's where we, with the practice of meditation, we're simply just aligning ourselves with a clarity that's innate, that's natural to us. So meditating is where the Buddha very kindly, he devised the methodology in which it wasn't expected that we already are perfect. There's taking into accommodation our present situation. And that's where, of course, you could say, well, you know, just be mindful, you know, and just be open-minded, you know, just be kind and compassionate and so on, you know. Just see through duality, you know, forget all about this subject object and so on. The Buddha could have said that, you know, and then he could have had a philosophy, you know, the philosophy of not to and all of that. The Buddha rather was about us working with our character, with our being. And that's where we are so much more in a condition of well-being when we slow down, when we're not gripped by our speed. And so the first aspect of shamatha is really us coming home to our body, to properly grounding ourselves in our physicality and being properly present. That's also where the modern person is so, you could say, challenged, because there's so much information to be had. You know, there's the internet now. Nowadays, so much Buddhist study is so confused, so profoundly confused. As an instructor, I'm witness to how people get immensely confused because they're not just learning with somebody as in an apprenticeship, but while they're learning something, then they're sort of out there looking all sorts of other places and just, you could say, an inundation of information. That's where the modern person is continually being entertained, continually being exposed to things that just keep them sort of circling in their heads. And so meditation is not easy for the modern person, because not so much that they don't have a talent for meditation or anything, but because the modern person is so addicted to continually being busy. And of course, like I often mention, this is also sort of part of some of our cultural heritage, the idea of the Protestant work ethic, where you're supposed to be busy in order to be a worthy human. But the practice of meditation is not at all being inactive. It's being very proactive, but it is doing something that is radical, and that is connecting, grounding ourselves properly. And that's where it's immensely important, this aspect of shamatha, settling, abiding by a framework, physical framework with which we sit and properly relate to our body. Properly relate to our body in its, you could say, full sense. So that's where we don't just sort of slouch or anything, but we fully sit and properly engage. Doesn't matter if we're sitting on the ground or if we're sitting on a chair, but we're properly here in our body. This creates the first aspect of shamatha, which is physical calm, grounding. And then we enable our mind to be properly present again, because we're so used to just being all over the shop. Then we need to have something that brings us back. And that's where we settle with something that's not conceptual. And that's where we come back to something like a blue flower, come back to an image of the Buddha. Sometimes in some traditions, you just look at a rock or a flame or whatever. But here we come back to the breath. The breath is very immediate, very not cerebral and conceptual, very much part of our living being, and just connecting with the breath. But again, not in the sense of it being a trance, but us just being aware of being present through just connecting with the breath. And at that point, we just mainly focus on the out breath, because the out breath is what takes us out of ourselves, enables us to connect beyond just the sort of internal obsession with our thinking and just tagging along in this unconscious processes of our various storylines and so on. So just being aware of the out breath, fusing with space, and then relaxing. And again, being aware of the out breath as it fuses with space, being properly here in this room, in this space, wherever we might be. We could be sitting in a small space or a big space, but we're relating fully with this space. And so then, as we do that, we are aware very precisely of the breath that goes out. We're fully present with the breath. In the tradition, we sometimes would count the breath, because that actually enables us to see when we lose it. We're sort of counting our breath. We're being aware of 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. Then all of a sudden, we sort of go, oh yes, I was supposed to be counting my breath. So then you know when you drop the ball. So that's where it can sometimes be helpful. But it's also important that we don't sort of try to develop some sort of, how do you say, competitive spirit. Oh yeah, I beat my personal record. Yes, I've done, I up to this number, then I'm this number, and then so we might sort of check with our neighbor, how are you doing, and stuff like that. So that's why this is not for the purpose of becoming competitive with others or ourselves, but really just to become aware how we drop the ball and actually begin to really be more determined to be present. But all along, we do so really with this gentleness that is just connecting with being properly present. And that's where sometimes then the understanding that we have from studies, understanding how valuable this is, how we're doing ourselves a favor, and how this is something that is looking and gaining experience in a field that is valuable for ourselves and for others as well. So we are determined, not in an obsessive way, but just gently coming back to the awareness of the out breath. And then as we sit, then we'll notice that as the mind does, there's thoughts. And we'll notice that we get distracted by the thoughts. And then we come back. And again, all of a sudden we realize we've been distracted. We just come back. There's nothing surprising in that. It's always been the nature of our situation that we're distracted. So when we discover that we're distracted, there's no need to worry about it, but just come back. Just recognizing that instant of recognizing that we're distracted, that brings us back. That's good. But there's also not a sense that the thoughts then are a problem, that we'd be better off if we had less thoughts. We naturally have thoughts. That's the nature of our mind. It has the quality of thinking. And while we think of thoughts in terms of objects and we get entangled with them, what we're doing here, which is different, is that we're seeing really the context of the thoughts and just aware of the thoughts. We don't get absorbed by them. This needs experience. So we can't just right away click with that, but we need to actually experience that. But to not be caught by the thoughts essentially means to not be distracted by the thoughts. We are juggling something and there's some noise going on, maybe what is that? This, as a kid, you had this race with holding a spoon and then an egg, right? That's where you mustn't be distracted, doesn't work. Likewise, when we're having a conversation with someone, it's going to be very annoying for the other person if every time something happens that we're looking elsewhere. We need to remain undistracted. So we know what not distracting means. And it's not as if we're going to have the whole street has to stop because we need to focus. And it's not as if we have to stop thoughts just so that we cannot be distracted. It's just that remaining distracted, being aware of the thoughts, we're aware that maybe there was a big truck that drove by outside, or some people are talking loud at the table next to us. We're aware of that, but we just remain focused. So in this way, we are not about doing something that's really new, but also this is where we, in not being absorbed, we begin to gain some autonomy, and we begin to gain some independence of these storylines that take place, where we're sort of imagining things or thinking about things or narratives that we're regurgitating. This happened to me, that happened to me, all of that. We need to understand that whatever is happening right here. It has no connection to the past. It's happening right now, and we have the choice to sustain non-distraction. And we sometimes are distracted, absorbed by the thoughts, but then we come back. So we see the validity and the reality of meditation in that it's actually what brings us back to being fully, properly present. So in that way, we have two aspects of the meditation, which is the posture and the non-distraction through attention to the breath. And that's what these two aspects really constitute what we can call shamatha. And then the presence of the thoughts that arise when we're not entangled with them, and when we begin to have some appreciation of how thoughts are actually what continually perpetuate our delusion, we begin to enter into a dimension of what we could call vipassana, wider perspective, which is essentially us bursting this bubble in which we are perpetuating this whole drama around me and other. So bursting that bubble is where we begin to have some wider perspective, and also where we begin to have empathy for ourselves, for the world, and a greater sense of openness. And this also is something we carry into post-meditation. So in this way, the practice of meditation is really sustained on the basis of us connecting with reality, and we integrate this as much as we can, of course, in post-meditation. When we do meditation practice here as a group, we then do it in combination with periods of walking meditation. And that's where we continue the practice of mindfulness through awareness when we walking. Otherwise, we might just think, I can only meditate when I'm sitting down. Or, oh, now really big meditation experience happening. I'm not moving. I sometimes see this on some of the retreats. All of a sudden somebody's got something, wow, something's really happening. I'm not going to move. I'm not going to do the walking meditation. I want to stay here. And that's really just grasping at some particular experience. That's not really particularly helpful. Maybe in some traditions there's emphasis on what you call jhans, and so then people say, oh, so and so stays for such a long time in meditation and so on. But that's of course can be very helpful in terms of seeing the primacy and the impact of the mind, and having a greater sense of the mind, but it doesn't actually extract us from fixation. It could very well become the cause of a further kind of samsara, more spiritual samsara, in which we still are fixating. So to alternate between sitting and walking meditation is very helpful. When we engage into more, you could say, advanced meditation practices, then it's actually seen as very helpful to sort of not be bound by meditation. Anyway, the walking meditation is where we focus on the sensation of our feet, and it's very much again this quality of not being caught up in our heads, but feeling. So that's where, when we're sitting meditating, practicing sitting on a seat, then we focus on the breath, coming back to the breath. And when we're doing walking meditation, it's the sensation of the footstep coming down on the heel, fully on the ground, and then the up step. We're aware of that as we're doing walking meditation. That enables us then to integrate this sense of movement. We preface the practice of meditation with something called blessing. And as religious and mystical as that might sound, blessing refers to this condition of inspiration that goes beyond the ordinary rational mind. it's being awed, it's being touched by something that's greater than ourselves. And that's where we benefit tremendously when we encounter dimensions that are greater than us. If we think of Mahatma Gandhi, if we think of Dalai Lama, we're thinking of something that's greater than us. It actually, just through our openness and our devotion, through this quality of being receptive, being humble, and also appreciating something that's big and beautiful, that enables us to engage with a much larger capacity that's innate to us, but because at the end of the day, it's ourselves that are actually experiencing this. So before meditation in the various traditions, you either read scripture or you in one way or another generate a state of mind that is great. And here we engage with meditation, invoking the presence of the Buddha. And this comes actually in an extraordinary lineage from the great Jamgön Kongtrul, a sage who lived in the 19th and 20th century, passed away in 1912. And Mipa had a vision of the Buddha and wrote this beautiful liturgy that we refer to as the Treasury of Blessings. And in there, we engage with the presence of the Buddha and then absorb the Buddha or the reference point of Buddha as external, and then we meditate. So this is very much something that informs and sets the context really for us when we're practicing meditation. So, so we'll do that. I'll bring up on this page here the I haven't done it yet. Okay, I will do that. I'll just we'll just take a 2-minute break and then I'll set that up. I'll just see if there's. Somebody says, "Yay, I got the 3." Very good. Okay, we'll just take a 2-minute break and then we'll begin. Thank you. So we'll begin the practice. Also, when we invoke the Buddha, we're invoking the Buddha as a reflection of our Buddha nature. On one hand, we understand the Buddha as someone extraordinary, but the extraordinariness of the Buddha was the Buddha manifested the innate quality that's universal for all beings. So this is in which the beauty of the Buddha lies, and that's also why we resonate with the Buddha. So using the duality of thinking of the Buddha as external, as a vehicle, then it becomes the entrance into discovering what the Buddha, of course, was all about, which is showing us this nature that is innately inherent to ourselves. So we begin with repeating what we call taking refuge and developing the enlightened attitude 3 times, and then we chant the 4 immeasurables, wishing all beings happiness, wishing them freedom from suffering, wishing them never to be apart from happiness, and wishing this equally for all. And then we go on to visualizing the Buddha presently in front of us. And then we have what's called the 7 aspects of puja, which is offering, bowing down, offering, discontinuing negative patterns, rejoicing in what is wholesome, what is helpful, and requesting teachings, requesting the Buddha not to pass away, and dedicating the merit. And then that's followed by a short invocation of the Buddha, and particularly then the mantra of the Buddha. What we call dharani. Sometimes dharanis are very long. Here, in fact, the dharani is actually just a few syllables longer than what we then refer to as the mantra. And then we chant the mantra for but I chanted 100 times on behalf of everyone. You're welcome to chant along. And then we dissolve the external reference point of the Buddha, and then we settle into meditation. Yeah. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness in the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is a great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance, no protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Deyadao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Muni Muni Maha Om Mani Mani Maha Munaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened to genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location, there is no perception, there are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life forms. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatha where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with the flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure. With an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements, so earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya, the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Agashasya stiti yavat yavachan jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuyaha jagaduka ninignataha. Agashasya stiti yavat yavachan jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuyahat jagaduka ninignataha. Tavam mama stiti bhuyahat jagaduka ninignataha. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagaduka ninignataha. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us here. And just in case you have some free time, if there's nothing pressing on Netflix or other commitments, then here daily, pretty much daily, there are some readings of Milarepa. So that's happening. If you're on the SIA mailing list, then you probably have received the link, and we'll be continuing that throughout October. And after that, probably reading something else. So more or less daily, sometimes like this Thursday not happening, but otherwise generally there. All right. Thank you very much, and see you again.